because of the situation in Afghanistan, a special webinar has been arranged by IGRO Foundation, keeping in the tradition that we are a policy think tank, providing inputs, analyzing the issues, and following the research-based policy advice. And the money on the top with us. To chair the session is Dr. Arvind Virmani, our chairman of the foundation. Dr. Virmani has been at the helm of policy making for a very long time. He was at the Planning Commission. He was the Chief Economic Advisor of Government of India. He was the Executive Director at International Monetary Fund. He was also the Chairman and Director at ICRIAR. And he has published in refereed journals extensively. He has books to his credit. So he's a prolific writer, scholar and a researcher, and his areas of research include the geopolitical situation. We request him to chair the session today and conduct the proceedings further. Dr. Virmani, please.
Wait.
Unmute.
Okay, I was mute. Sorry. Let me start again. So we are very fortunate to have Ambassador Kajju, who since his retirement, I have interacted with him in many seminars, particularly on Pakistan, Afghanistan, and the whole South Asian region and beyond. So let me give a brief introduction. Of course, he's a retired secretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He retired in 2011, but I didn't really recall hearing, but in 1999, when he was in the Pakistan department, he dealt with the Indian Airlines Flight 814 hijacking and was also there during the Kargil war when things got hot with Pakistan. So he has a lot of experience with Pakistan. In 2001, during the Agra summit, he was part of the negotiating team. He has been ambassador to Myanmar, ambassador to Afghanistan, and ambassador to Thailand. So he has extensive experience in the region, and we are very happy that you could join us for this kind of emergency seminar, if I may call it that, given that how active Afghanistan is. With that, let me hand it over to you, Mr. Kajju.
Thank you, Dr. Virmani. Thank you, Mr. Charan Singh. Thank you for your invitation to this opportunity to interact with you on an issue which, of course, is attracting international attention at the moment, and which is also of crucial significance to India's security and foreign policy interests. The current situation in Afghanistan is quite clear. The Taliban have won. The Americans were there for 20 years, and it had become quite clear some years ago that the Americans were in strategic distress and they were planning a strategic retreat from Afghanistan, and now they have suffered a definite strategic defeat. So from distress to retreat to defeat. And the Taliban in the end seem to have achieved their military objectives with considerable ease. I think it all began with the announcement of President Biden, wherein I think it was on April 15th that he made this Afghanistan announcement, saying that he was standing by the agreement with the Taliban that his predecessor had signed, and also saying that the US forces and NATO forces will withdraw. He extended the time of 1st May till 11th September. But once he had confirmed that the American forces and NATO forces will withdraw, uh, in a manner of speaking, it set the stage for Taliban's military activity. So while they were talking to the Afghans, to the Kabul people in Doha, I think military preparations were going on. And initially, one recalls they in June and July, they swept through their non-traditional areas in the north, in the northeast, as well as in the western parts of Afghanistan. And then in the second phase, they got hold of border crossing points, which were of significant importance, because if once the Taliban had got hold of them, and these were spread all around. I mean, they were in from Sher Khan Bandar with Tajikistan to the border crossing points with Turkmenistan to Islam Killa with Iran, and then finally Spin Boldak with Pakistan. So they had given the intention quite clearly that they would not allow Afghanistan to go out of their grip. And finally, I think even though military analysts all over the world thought that it will not be as easy for the Taliban to get hold of provincial centers and leave alone the major cities of Kandahar, Herat, Jalalabad, and Mazar-e-Sharif. And of course, Kabul, everyone thought was protected. In the end, all these provincial centers and the major cities fell literally like 9 pins. Uh, there will be enormous writing now going forward about the reasons of the American defeat, the reasons for the collapse of Afghan forces, the disintegration of their political elite. But amidst all this, one cannot overlook the fact that the Pakistanis have succeeded in their aim of getting the Taliban back in control in Afghanistan. Pakistan had never reconciled to the situation which came about in 2001 following 9/11. At that stage, they had no alternative but to support the Americans. But if you see please forgive me. But if you see the history of the past, just 1 second, please forgive me, I'll put this on mute. If you see the history of the past 20 years, I think the Pakistanis played the Americans extremely well. They handed over initially Al Qaeda low level operatives, got a lot of money for it. And they also got from the Americans in the initial years at least a kind of a tacit arrangement wherein the Americans allowed them to keep the Taliban going and hand over these Al Qaeda members. Consequently, the Taliban remained the instrument of Pakistan, and it still is an instrument. I think the connections between Pakistan and the Al-Qaeda are very close, as everyone knows, and the support given to, the Taliban, misspoke, it's not Al-Qaeda, the Taliban are very close, and uh, it was no doubt the support given by the Pakistanis to the Taliban, which enabled the Taliban to achieve the kind of success that they did. Now, amidst all the reasons that can be looked at for the current situation, how come it came to pass that this entire enterprise that the Americans had engaged in just fell apart? I think that there are two, one military and one political. The military situation, to my mind, goes back to the difficulties that the Americans faced, which were like the difficulties that the Soviets faced, which was to confine their activities to the Afghan theater, whereas the true theater was not only Afghanistan but also Pakistan. In the case of the Soviets, the Mujahideen had sanctuaries, safe havens, and support bases in Pakistan from where they were able to ingress into Afghanistan to really give great pain to the Soviet forces. And herein, it was the same thing when it came to the Americans. The Taliban had their sanctuaries, their safe havens, their support bases, where they could, in Pakistan, from where they could recuperate, they could regroup, they could look at their tactics and then cross over and gradually, like the Mujahideen, they spread through the country. And during this period, they were able to really exhaust the patience of the Americans. I recollect I think it was in 2016 that I asked a very senior American officer who was leading American forces in Afghanistan if it was possible for America to accomplish its Afghan mission of finishing the Taliban unless the American forces entered into Pakistan to clean up the Taliban and really tackle them there. And he was candid enough to say no. So by 2016, there was a stalemate, clearly a stalemate, and the stalemate was to the advantage of the Taliban, which brings me to the political dimension, and that was, to my mind, not only was there a continuing absence of let me use that old-fashioned word, unity in the Kabul elite, there was also the incapacity of the Pashtun part of the Kabul elite to combat Taliban ideology and theology in the Pashtun stronghold in the southern and eastern parts of the country. The Kabul elite, led by the two presidents, the former President Karzai and the present president, and the president who showed a rather clean pair of heels at the end of it all, Ashraf Ghani, simply did not move out in any meaningful way of the presidential palace or the Arg. The Arg is the main seat of power in Afghanistan, in Kabul, and used to be the palace of the kings, and then now, of course, it's the presidential palace since 1973, after Dawood Khan overthrew his cousin King Zahid Shah. Now, I do consider this important because the the Kabul notables, the Pashtun notables in Kabul, really proceeded on the old ways, whereas the old ways had gone, they had the Taliban giving them enormous opposition, and yet they left the field open to them. They never went there, never sat, leave alone the province, not only in the villages, and uh, they didn't even go and spend as much time as required in the provincial areas, provincial capitals, primarily because what they thought were security reasons. But if you leave the field open in this fashion, then naturally the Taliban were able to consolidate their position in ideological and also in theological terms, because the ulama too were not inspired to take on the changes in the Afghan mazhab that the Taliban were bringing about. So I mentioned this to set the background uh, to show why the Taliban had it so easy. But what came, I must confess, as a bit of surprise to me too, was the ease with which they rolled over the Tajiks and the Uzbeks, not the Hazaras to that extent, but the Tajiks and the Uzbeks. And it seems to me that even the Tajik and the Uzbek leadership, more the Tajik than the Uzbek leadership, also lost touch with the ground. Salahuddin Rabbani, for instance, who became the foreign minister and who became head of the Jamiyat, the main Tajik party, succeeded his father, the former president, Burhanuddin Rabbani, who was assassinated by a Taliban assassin in 2012, also didn't have the connect in Badakhshan. The Rabbani stronghold as his father did. And someone told me only recently when I was talking, someone very knowledgeable about this, when I was talking to him, I said, how did this happen that in Badakhshan, the Taliban just rolled over and they didn't really have a base in Badakhshan to speak? And he asked me, in turn, he said, how many times did Salahuddin go to Badakhshan to nurture his constituency? He lost it all. So I'm giving you these reasons to show that this was an enterprise which really never took root. And that leads me to this one thought which I leave with you, which is that nations cannot be built, nation building cannot take place through these new approaches of the international community of peacemaking and then peace building, which pursues a one size fit all kind of a thing. And even though President Biden now very grudgingly accepts, initially he said that the objective of the American enterprise was against terrorism, which it has accomplished, and it was not nation building. But recently I saw that he has admitted in an ABC interview, I think, where he said that these other add-ons were taken on board like nation building and which really didn't work. And nations can't be built from the outside. I think you all know that. So, in conclusion, on this section, let me say the Taliban and the Pakistanis have clearly won. Now, which brings me to my second section, my talk, which is this, that winning the war is one thing, winning peace is quite another. And Afghanistan has been in turmoil, to my mind, from 1973. Once the monarchical system was overthrown, even though people generally trace it from 1978, from the time Daoud Khan was killed by the communists, and then in 79, the Soviets came in. I think that the Afghan structure, which was undergoing stresses, the rise of Islamism, the rise of communist ideologies, and communist groups, from the 1960s were creating pressures, but the structure really started cracking with the end of the monarchical system. And since then, the country unfortunately has remained in a period of continuing instability. The question today is whether the Taliban victory and Pakistani success will again lead to the instability going on, or whether there is some chance of some kind of peace and the beginnings of stability to return to Afghanistan. I think that, to my mind, is the crucial issue. And I say this, though, while I'm mindful that international attention is focused today and naturally on the evacuation of forces. The pictures that we are all seeing on television and which are being streamed all over the world, we are seeing on our computers, are very distressing. They are showing absolute chaos at the Kabul airport, and that is grabbing international attention. There's also this entire question whether the Taliban will be able to bring in an administration which will guarantee, if not fully, partially at least, or to a considerable extent, human rights, especially the rights of women and of minorities. These issues are important because the first issue of evacuation and the way the Americans were taken by surprise is enmeshed with American domestic politics. And the second, of course, evokes, that's of human rights, evokes memories of the Taliban rule of the 1990s, which was nothing but medieval barbarism. Yet, to my mind, the crucial issue today is of government formation. I say this because at the end of the day, the evacuation will be over. Those the foreign nationals will all leave. I think the Taliban will ensure that foreign nationals leave. Afghans, I'm not quite sure whether all Afghans associated with NATO forces or other countries who are fearful of their future will be able to leave. But a large number of them will also leave. So once this period is over, naturally the focus would come directly on the formation of the central authority. I think in the past 9 days since the Taliban took over Kabul on August 15th, what we've seen in the country is that the shadow apparatus which the Taliban had put in place in the provinces has emerged. And in some ways, it is providing a kind of a skeletal system in the country. It's still very divided. It's nebulous, but it is there. And hence, despite these reports of excesses, and there are no doubt that there would be excesses in some cases, yet it seems that through the country, this shadow apparatus of governors and shadow police people, etc., is providing some kind of a holding operation in the country. Now, the question is, what will be the nature of the central authority in Kabul? On that, uh, there are major question marks. We all have read in the media that the Taliban did not rush in to form a central authority, which I think showed a certain amount of sophistication and maturity on their part. Second, they seem to have they have in fact entered into negotiations with the members of the old Kabul elite, which President Karzai, Abdullah, even Gulbuddin Hikmatyar has been mentioned. And most significantly, I thought that the erstwhile Northern Alliance leadership, which had played a very prominent part in the Islamic Republic, people like the Hazara leaders, Karim Khalili and Muhammad Muhaqiq, the brothers of Ahmad Shah Massoud, Ahmad Zia and Ahmad Wali, Kanuni, and with the speaker of their Vulisi Jarga or the National Assembly, they all went to Pakistan to discuss, which of course also indicated the centrality of Pakistan to this entire process. So there is Pakistan, which is trying to help in the creation of a central authority. And the terms being bandied about these days is an inclusive Islamic government. Now, the Americans and Western countries are stressing, and there is a meeting today of the G7 leaders, the G7 heads, about Afghanistan. And I have no doubt that they will also emphasize the fact that, as is being stressed, that unless there is some kind of an inclusive government, the Taliban will not get a Taliban central authority, will not get legitimacy, leave alone recognition. Now, I personally don't understand the word legitimacy very much. As a former diplomat, I understand the term recognition. There is a diplomatic recognition, there is a recognition of a government or a state by the international community. And if there is recognition, then there is legitimacy. But legitimacy is a term which has various values associated. I think diplomatic recognition has a certain more definiteness about it. So what the Americans are basically telling them is that, look, we will not recognize your government unless it's inclusive. Some days ago, the Dawn newspaper of Pakistan carried a very insightful column. And those of you who are interested in Afghan developments, I would recommend that you go through that column, and it's by Khurram Hussain, who is one of the very thoughtful journalists. He made the point that the Afghan state, which the Taliban will now, or the central authority now will have to run, will be very different from the state the Taliban captured in 1996. That was a broken state altogether. And that state, they could manage on the money that was being raised by the state itself, as well as money, financial flows that were coming in through narcotics. Let's not be taken in by the fact that the Taliban in the 1990s were able to clamp down on narcotics. I think that they were trying a correction in the opium market, the illicit opium and heroin market. But so they were able to manage it with those flows. Today, and I'm mindful of the fact that I'm speaking to a group of great economists, and I'm no economist, so I'll stand corrected. But the point Khurram was making, which I think has a ring of truth, is that the present state can't depend on these flows. it needs assistance from abroad. And in a manner of speaking, he was articulating the great fears, I think, of the Pakistani establishment. That should these flows not come, then the Afghan economy, which will be contracting in any case now, might just simply collapse. And if it collapses, then the Pakistan nightmare scenario will emerge, which is the movement of refugees. As it is, they have about 3 million refugees which have been there for decades. But now they face the prospects of another 3 to 4 million. And another 3 to 4 million, despite the fencing and everything that they've done, they will not be able to stop. So it is in the vital interest of Pakistan too that some kind, that the central authority which is formed continues to have some kind of legitimacy. The question is whether there is sufficient unity among the Taliban and a sufficient understanding among their leaders to realize that they'll have to show a vast degree of ideological flexibility and accommodation for the formation of such a central authority. Initially, it had seemed when the talks over the last few days, when the talks were taking place, the reports that were coming from Kabul and the Twitter accounts and the photographs, etc., it had seemed that there was some hope that this would come. To date, too, the hope remains, but it is not as firm as it was. I saw one report in a Afghan website which says that the Afghan leaders, which means the Kabul leaders, are saying that serious discussions have not begun on government formation and that what is taking place is only consultations. So at the moment now, there are still question marks about whether an inclusive authority will be formed. But to my mind, the Pakistanis will try their best that some kind of a central authority which is acceptable to the international community is formed. Which brings me to the point that clearly, as far as the Russians, the Chinese, and I think the Iranians, leave alone the Pakistanis are concerned, they would have little difficulty in dealing with even and a non-inclusive Taliban authority if it is established. The question is, and you will be able to, I think the economists among you who have studied China so well will be able to perhaps focus more authoritatively on this than I can. The question is if the Chinese would be willing to bankroll such a central authority. At least experience shows me that the Chinese are very wary of bankrolling anyone without getting something in return, unlike the Americans, who are perhaps a little more, for want of a better word, let me say, generous in these matters. But the Chinese aren't. Their assistance is more project oriented, and while they will certainly like to integrate Afghanistan, yet in the immediate future, I think vast sums of money won't flow. So these are important questions before us to which we really have no answers. These are imponderable. I'll say three more things because I've badly distributed my time and I had 40 minutes. And first is this Panjshir challenge, the challenge from Amrullah, etc. I think Panjshir is a valley which has been defended well in the past by Ahmad Shah Massoud during the jihad, and he was able to defend it successfully against the Taliban in the 1990s. Yet today, I think that even if the Panjshir Valley doesn't fall, Yet the capacity for Amrullah and Ahmad Shah Massoud's son Ahmad to be able to gain sufficient territory as to cause trouble to the Taliban, central authority, Taliban formed central authority, will not be substantial. Uh, Partly because in the 1990s, apart from India, which was supporting anti-Taliban forces, there was also Iran and Russia in the field, and Iran and Russia are not there now. And therefore, to sustain in any meaningful manner uh, an anti-Taliban force will be difficult unless the Americans decide to change course, which for the time being doesn't seem like. The next is on narcotics. Narcotics is something which does not, Afghan narcotics doesn't attract as much attention as it should. Whereas in the 1990s, it was estimated at one stage that 1/3 of all the funds that were flowing through the Afghan economy came from narcotics. Now, of course, the portion has fallen very substantially, but still, I think narcotics not only vitiates the social and political fabric, it also causes the kind of turbulence in the country, which is a cause for instability. And it will not be easy to get a control on the narcotic situation because it's linked to the international narcotics trade. And as you know, they fight very hard, the international narcotics big boys. Now, as far as the regional situation is concerned, which brings me to India, I see major difficulties for India in the Western neighborhood. And that is largely because while the Chinese will be very wary, they may not throw in a lot of funds, yet the long-term Chinese objective is quite clear. It is to integrate countries to India's west with the western parts of China economically. And in this context, and through connectivity, and in this context, Pakistan is in their bag. It's a client state. They're making a very big play for Iran. We can discuss this someday. In the Central Asian states, they are well entrenched economically. The missing link, therefore, as I call it, is Afghanistan. And while they'll go about it slowly, they'll also do it steadily, and they will make a play for Afghanistan, along with Pakistan and Russia, which they'll be acting in harmony with Russia. So, therefore, while there will be some misgivings in the Central Asian states and these developments, especially in Tajikistan, yet at the end of the day, the challenges that we will face are going to be formidable. And that is why, for many years, I personally have been advocating that we should have opened up to the Taliban, and the whole world was talking openly and directly with them, but we did not. And I thought that our strategic interests demanded this, so that we could have a toehold, perhaps more than a toehold, in Afghanistan. Now we will have to start from virtually ground zero. I don't know what the government is thinking, but I do think that once a central authority is formed, then we should establish contact with them, with that central authority, whether we like its ideological positions or not. We can condemn them, and with the international community, we can warn them on human rights and minority, especially women's rights and minority rights. Yet, I think our strategic interests demand contact. Diplomatic recognition is a different situation. That will, of course, follow. The first step would have to be contact, an open contact. A subterranean contact is good, it has its role. It can even complement open contacts, but I don't see uh, any alternative but to open contact once things settle down. I know that there are very profound strategic thinkers who are arguing in favor of strategic patience uh, and wait and watch. See, you wait and watch, but you can't wait and watch for a long time to come. Strategic patience shouldn't turn into strategic paralysis. In the past, I think we've been strategically paralyzed in Afghanistan. And when it comes to wait and watch, I can only hope, and let me end by saying that wait and watch can't be, if you permit, कि कारवां गुजर गया गुबार देखते. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kajru. Let me start the ball rolling. Let me start with two points or questions on the military side, and then maybe you can respond to that, and then I'll do the second set, which is your financial economic. It's reported that the Chief of Army Staff, Mr. Bajwa, or General Bajwa, visited Afghanistan on 11th May 2021. What in your view, I mean, assuming or if it is correct, what is the significance of that and how does it tie in with the offensive? That's one question on the military side. The second one is a bit of a puzzle for me, where you will know much more detail. But you know, when I looked at the Taliban soldiers or whatever you want to call them entering these various cities, you know, we had for the first time we had them going into every city in Afghanistan. They really remind me of something like Chambal dacoits adjusted to the 21st century, you know, with horses replaced by motorcycles, you know, these 303s replaced by AK-47. And so anyway, so that's kind of the image, and it puzzles me, you know. So if you can enlighten us on these 2 points, and then I can go to my next 3 points.
I think the Pakistanis were preparing themselves for different contingencies. They were aware that war fighting in Afghanistan is quite different from war fighting anywhere else. Yet I think they were not certain about how things will turn out, because while everyone could see that Kabul was disunited and that if Kabul's disunity, political disunity, would necessarily impact on the morale of the army, yet I think because the army had been trained by the Americans and the army looked a modern army, in sharp contrast to what you say was the appearance of the Taliban boys. So there was always this question mark as to how it will eventually play out. The move, what I think heartened the Pakistanis was the ease with which the Taliban boys moved into the rural area, which was plan 1 or chapter 1 of the movement in June and July. And when they sensed that they could do it with with so much of ease, then this plan started rolling. In Afghanistan, money has always been a very potent weapon of war. And there have been very few cases when there have been pitched battles of the kind we imagine that, Stalingrad and cities being attacked and defended, etc. if you see the movement, the Taliban expansion of the 1990s, it was much the same. It was over a longer period. But there's a certain flavor to this. I said this to a group of some Indian retired generals, and they all gave me a earful that I knew nothing about military tactics, etc. But I urged them, I said, please see how things happen in Afghanistan. And once a side shows clearly that it's going to win, then they offer the other side that, look, don't fight, which happened in some cases here, that you hand over your weapons, take off your uniforms, we'll give you some money, go back to your villages, and the matter ends. So, and that is what was seen in some cases here. Now, as far as the appearance of the Taliban goes, don't go by that. I mean, they are boys from the Pashtun countryside. And this is their natural apparel, and whether we like it or not, it doesn't show. I think some of them must be very savvy at using digital technology, smartphones, etc. But I'm not quite sure whether they do it deliberately to create an aura about them. All that I can't say because I haven't seen any evidence of it. But if you see some old photographs, black and white photographs of Pashtun tribesmen, you will find the same long hair, patte, guns, firearms, etc. So I for one was not particularly surprised by it.
So, sorry, one follow-up question. In all this, I have been unable to understand, we keep hearing about this 300,000 Afghan army or maybe 30,000. I haven't been able to conceive what kind of structure was there. What was there any structure to that army, or it was just hanging around all over the place?
No, I think there was a structure.
Okay.
There was a structure. There was a structure of the old army too. An army. There was an Afghan army created during the period of the king. Then in the republic. Then the Soviets. When the Soviets came in, they had this army, etc. And if you see the period between 1989, when the Soviets left Afghanistan, to 1992, when Najib fell, following the dissolution of the Soviet Union, that period, and you compare it with the period now, it offers a very interesting food. It offers a very rich fare for thought. So what happened? There were those 3 years, and now there's this period. And I think part of this was the critical political leadership. All my writings on Afghanistan since I retired, I maintained and I still believe, and I used to say that the army will dissolve if there's political disunity and if it fractures. And it was clearly fracturing.
Okay.
Ghani, at the end of the day, I mean, he may have great credentials as a cultural anthropologist and as a World Bank executive, etc. And maybe a very fine international civil servant and has a very comprehensive mind. Yet he has no leadership. He had no leadership qualities. He was put there. Abdullah was robbed of an election thrice. So
okay, that's a fact. Yeah, I've been wondering about that. Yeah, Abdullah probably won, right?
Abdullah was robbed of it thrice. In 2009, it was closer. Certainly in 14, and absolutely certainly in 2019. They thought that they needed a full-blooded Pashtun. The West felt more comfortable with Ghani because he spoke their kind of language and this large conceptualization, etc. But what was the leadership quality that he showed in the end? I mean, all this now he can justify his fleeing. But that broke as it is, the army was dissolving. He didn't.
Okay, yeah, I think that makes sense. Sorry, as I've got you after a long time, but one element, oh shoot, is gone out of mind. Okay, let me go to the next set because then we are taking up too much time. So there are three, again, you can answer as briefly or as long as you want, but starting funds. I mean, after all, it's a potentially moderate Islamic emirate. It's all confusing, but Islamic charities, whether it's Qatar or other countries I don't want to mention, wouldn't they be eager to fund an Islamic Emirates? The first kind of formal, leaving aside
What are we talking of? I mean, the quantum of funds
Yeah,
that will be
that's-
necessary to sustain this structure and prevent
yeah,
a large scale. I won't you prevent a collapse. Let me
right.
use, for want of a better word. I don't know the gradations that you economists use, but
Okay,
what I'm saying is,
that's fine. It's
and
more of a throw-off question. Okay, next question.
no. And
Right.
prevent this would be far more than
Yeah.
the charities and these will be able to provide. Far
Right,
more.
right.
They
Right,
just
I
can't.
agree.
It
I
has to be
agree.
through international agencies and G7
Okay,
countries,
yeah,
etc.
you're right. Okay, so second one, this is more, again, another somewhat speculative one. Given, I've studied communist countries and parties for a long time, but the standard tactic in semi-democratic or, other countries where you can't overthrow the government directly is to form a united front government, take control of all the key ministries, and then have these front men run it till you are able to take full control. The Chinese, the Pakistanis know this. Okay? Wouldn't that be a good way to set up the government?
Well,
And give you
yes,
time?
I think that is part of the desire that you have a government which the international community will be able to accept, which means the West will be able to accept, because I'm convinced that the Chinese and the Russians will accept any kind of government, because the Taliban and the Pakistanis behind them have been skillful enough to give the Chinese an assurance on the Uyghur militants. And the Russians are very fearful of ISIS, and they've given them that commitment. We won't allow these. And they'll honor them, because they know that without China and Russia, they'll be in deep trouble.
So, what follows from this is that my hypothesis is, and I'll link it to your China point and then you can react, is that Haqqani, who is in some sense the closest to the Pakistani military, could be the defense minister who could be in charge of security, which could include, and this I heard from somebody else, I can't remember his name, but an IRGC type of structure of Iran. And they were the ones who, behind the scenes, provide security to China enough to make them feel secure, both about their investments and their ETIM or whatever the movement is called. And then they, in a sense, pay for the natural resources. So you are quite right. They are not just going to hand over money, but they buy out countries. They'll be quite willing to buy out the whole natural resources of Afghanistan, which could keep the thing going for a couple of years. So that is one scenario I think is possible. Your comments?
Look, I am convinced that whatever kind of quote unquote acceptable structure is pushed, the security apparatus will be under Taliban control. They will not let go of the intelligence agencies and the police, national police and the national army.
Okay.
Now, who among them will take charge is difficult to say. I suppose there'll be some kind of balancing done because I for one am not, I must confess, know the different actors, but I haven't seen any authoritative writing of the interplay between these different actors. We know Haibatullah, we don't know, he's certainly not Umar, he's not the last word. There's Umar's son Yaqub, there's Sirajuddin, there is Baradar. So we'll have to see how they play it now. And I dare say it will evolve in time to come. And hopefully that will create spaces for us.
Okay, last follow-up question, and then I'll give it to Charan and our other director. One of the puzzles, well, not a puzzle, but both the Emir, Abitullah, and Sirajuddin Haqqani, Deputy Emir or whatever he's called, are still in Pakistan. Is there any significance to it? Are they waiting till the government is in power and they can triumphantly march in, or what's going on?
Pakistan is central to government formation. I wrote a piece which was carried in the Hindustan Times last week after the fall of Kabul, where I said we've been out, we have no role, no space, no role in working on the new dispensation that will come in Kabul, whereas the Pakistanis are front and center. Now, that is both good and bad in the sense there's enormous pressure on them to get an acceptable government. And at the same time, they're in the driver's seat. So it's not surprising that these two gentlemen are still there because part of the action is still there. At one stage, before Baradar had come to Kabul, the 5 cities where action was taking place was Kabul, Kandahar, Quetta, Islamabad, and Peshawar. So if these, and we don't know, I for one don't know where is exactly Hebatullah or Sirajuddin, but there is coordination among them, and to a large extent, I think the Pakistanis are playing go between to see that these chaps mesh in, and it wouldn't be easy to get them all together because let us not forget that for close to 2 decades, their rank and file has been in the field, have borne all the struggle. So today, for example, they are told that the old Afghan flag will remain, that the name of the country will not be emirate, just the symbols. It will not be easy for them to accept it. They'll say कि भाई हम क्यों लड़े, क्यों अगर आप झंडा हमारा जो है वो पुराना झंडा है और नाम ही इमारात नहीं होगा तो फिर हम लड़े क्यों? So I think at the moment there are these things taking place, and there are these imponderables, not so easy to say कि क्या होगा. The only thing we can say with certainty is that I think there is a section of the Taliban which is alive to the conditions of 2021 and the need for cash. The Pakistanis are saying कि भाई पैसा तो आना है, नहीं तो फिर रेफ्यूजी 50 लाख रेफ्यूजी आ जाएगा तो इससे कैसे हैंडल करेंगे. और इसके साथ साथ वो भी सेक्शन है जो ओल्ड सेक्शन है वो कह रहा है देख लेंगे साहब. तो ये तो अभी देखने की बात है कैसे.
Right. I get your point, the complexity, right. Okay, so Charan and Colonel MP Singh, do you want to ask questions?
Colonel MP, why don't you go ahead first?
Thank you very much, sir. Sir, I have got just 2 questions. One is, of course, related to the military part. Now we are all aware, 20 years, US military has trained the Afghan, and they finished off like a pack of cards in less than 20 days. And about 83 billion worth of equipment was supplied. Now this is all sophisticated equipment. Now this Pakistan angle coming up, don't you think there's a danger of this equipment getting siphoned to Pakistan and thus posing a threat to us by some extent? Second point is the armed forces of Afghanistan, though they were structured by the US forces, are today a demoralized force. Now, will they be able to take work under the Taliban? Because Taliban is about 70,000, what I've read in number. The Afghan armed forces are approximately 2.5 lakhs to 3 lakhs. So would they be working subjugated to Taliban, or could there be still some pockets of resistance with the armed forces, within the armed forces, working under the Taliban? That's the second part, sir. The third part is seeing the kind of takeover Taliban has done of Afghanistan. Don't you feel it's an ideal situation for UN peacekeepers to come in because there is no government, there is no elected people, the refugee problem is coming up. So probably a multi-country force to contain all these complexities which are emerging in the political arena.
Let me answer the third question straight away, Colonel Saab. Which country will be foolhardy enough to send forces in a situation like that? The Taliban have won. There is no conflict anymore. UN forces go in where there's conflict. Where is the conflict? Today, if, just because there is one in Panjshir, there is a problem. But इस वक्त तो वो जीत गए हैं, उनकी फतह हुई है, तो कॉन्फ्लिक्ट कहाँ से? तो यूएन का तो स्कोप है ही नहीं, पहली चीज. दूसरी चीज, second is, I'm not quite sure where you got this figure of 83 billion is concerned. Over the last 20 years, they may have spent money in maintaining the force and training it, etc. And I dare say, if you look at it closely, a very substantial part of this 83 billion expenditure would have been going back to America through the training, which was through the trainers, both American Army regulars and the contractors who were imparting training. And then there would have been a lot of money spent on just salaries and other things, infrastructure that was constructed, that the bases that were built. I don't know what kind of budgeting they were doing. Maybe the Bagram base, all the money that was put in the Bagram base was budgeted to this 83 billion. So when it comes to equipment, what is the sophisticated equipment given to the Afghan forces? I'm not quite sure. Certainly, I've not seen that any sophisticated armor was given to them, or sophisticated RT was given to them, or any sophisticated elements of electronic warfare was given to them. And no, when it comes to air, they had only they had very rudimentary stuff in air also. So I don't think we've got to. I personally wouldn't be worried about some of this equipment going back. Yes, there has been some commentary that some of the equipment left behind in terms of helicopters, etc., which have not been destroyed by the Americans because of the speed of the Taliban sort of moves and takeover, will fall into the hands of the Pakistanis, the Chinese, and the Russians, and they might be able to examine their avionics and electronics and other things. So that's a possibility. But beyond that, as of now, I've not seen any evidence that would worry me about augmentation of all this to Pakistan. And lastly, the Afghan, when he comes into power there, might become a different entity. Let's not forget that.
Thank you, sir.
So, there is Mr. Farhad Sultani is from Afghanistan. He wants to ask a question. I will give him next, and then Major General Sudhakar, you can if you are there. Unless Charan wants to ask anything. Okay, so Mr. Farhad Sultani, you want to ask your question? Unmute.
Please.
Do I go ahead, sir? I am General Sudhakar. Do I go ahead, sir?
No. First, Mr. Sultani from Afghanistan.
Okay. Right.
Yeah, first. Yeah. Unmute, Mr. Sultani. No, you are still muted. Your unmute button on your. Hey, hello. Yeah, okay. I think
Yeah, good afternoon to all, and I'm very glad to be the part of this webinar. And I'm from Afghanistan. Currently, I'm in India in Bangalore, and I'm doing my PhD in political science department. Actually, sir, I have posed my question. I have two questions, and the first question, what does Afghan lead Taliban mean to India? And the second question, recently,
What is your first? Sorry to interrupt you. What does Afghanistan? So I couldn't follow your question, sir.
what does Afghan-led Taliban mean to India? Because, sir, I have concern. I have completed my MA in India, and currently I am pursuing my PhD in India. So the moment I go there, quite they have different perspectives about those students that have completed their education in India. And the second question, sir, right now, right now, Panjshir is not has not been conquered, or it's not in the hand of the Taliban. So their new resistance has shipped there under the leadership of young Ahmad Massoud. So what can India for them, and what can India really do for them, sir?
Okay.
Are you from Panjshir, Mr. Sultani?
No, sir, I do belong to the north part of Afghanistan, and if you
Which
give me
part?
just, I
No,
have
no,
a small remarks.
Quickly,
Yes,
quick.
Yeah. Sir, I do live in north part of Afghanistan, and I have grown up in war by chance. I know how the situation is very complicated. The moment Mazar was not in hand of Taliban, so even I have provided a part of like a solution to my friends who are working with Atom Mohammadi Noor. The right solution for Afghanistan would be partition, because if we don't go for partition, this war and this catastrophe will going on. I do propose them, so make a contact with the northern, with people who are in Panjshir. So if you start, fighting from there, then if you come directly from Panjshir to like Parwan, from Parwan to then Baghlan, from Baghlan, then you can go to Kunduz, from Kunduz, then you can come to Samangan, from Samangan, then you can come to Mazar, from Mazar you can go to Juzjan, from Juzjan you can go to like Saripol, Faryab, like that. On that time, so we had many more, many more opportunities, because the north part of Afghanistan is well tied with the Central Asia. So like Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan. So anyhow, I don't know why they didn't, take my consideration, and they didn't take that consideration, because I don't believe that the mentality of the Taliban has not changed yet, sir. I mean, keep in touch with most of my friends in north part of Afghanistan. The moment they get legitimacy, so they will start their brutality. So because still they're waiting for the diplomatic recognition, they're waiting for the international recognition. The moment that they have been recognized, so they will continue the same jobs, because the place where I'm living right now, they go to house to house, and they call those people that you have to provide food for mujahideen. Even those people, economically they cannot do anything. So even recently there was a guy has been appointed as a head of Balkh University. So if you see him, he's coming in the in an academic institution with a gun. The gunpoint is still alive there. I do only request from India, sir, even I proposed several times. So, let us like Iran, let us, I propose them. So if you create a TV that you have to broadcast what activities India has done in Afghanistan from since then, I'm sure India did the great things, and I'm, heartily thankful for them. But the people who are living in a village, they cannot understand what the India did for Afghanistan. So we need to broadcast them. We need to share with them.
Okay, thank you. There's a number of points he has made, and I think some suggestions. Some of them may have been valid earlier, but may not be. So whatever you want to respond, Mr. Kaju.
Mr. Sultani, I can feel, I can sense your great trouble, your feeling that what has happened in the recent past in Afghanistan. I myself am familiar with some of the parts that you have mentioned. I've traveled in northern Afghanistan myself. I met some of the leaders, including the leader, the great leader you have mentioned, Atta Sahib. I think in Panjshir, yes, there is a tradition of resisting authority from outside. Panjshir played a great role during the jihad and the resistance under the leadership of Amir Saab. But today's situation, while I don't doubt the resolve and the strength, the courage of either Amrullah or of Ahmed, yet the practical situation is such that I'm not quite sure what would be the extent of play that would be available. So that is a question mark. I don't have an answer. Second, as far as your point that a breakup of Afghanistan, I don't know whether the international community is prepared for that kind of a radical reordering of the state as of now. Third, and that is the point that I made, Mr. Sultani, earlier, since you are from the north, you are from Shamal, I would imagine you are either from Kunduz or Takhar, Samangan, but I'm still not able to understand the ease with which the Taliban moved in there. My own impression earlier was that the old Pashtun communities in these parts, which were settled during the time of Amir Abdul Rahman Khan, gave support to the Taliban, but not the Uzbek, the Hazara or the Tajik. But now it seems to me that they have greater acceptability even among them. And I hear of various religious leaders among the Uzbeks and the Tajiks of this area who have been in sympathy with the Taliban. So you'll know all this better. But these are things that are relevant at this time. And my last point is that I can understand your pain. You are studying here. Afghanistan was moving towards a democracy. You are studying political science in a country which is a democracy. You are doing your PhD. I really think that people like you are going to be the future of Afghanistan. And with people like you there, I have no doubt that this period of even regressive ideologies will not last.
Thank
And
you.
therefore, my appeal to you would be not to lose heart. These periods come in all countries. And with brave people like you, countries overcome these.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. General Sudhakar.
Sir, good evening, Ambassador Kadzo. I am a very avid student of you. Your talks are throughout NDC, Army War College. I must compliment you, sir, for an outstanding talk, very stimulating one. But after having heard you, sir, latest on Afghanistan, frankly speaking, I'm taking liberty with you as a very keen student of yours. There are too many questions coming in the mind. I am a retired general today, and I have been very closely following what's going on in Afghanistan. I have been reading up the documents prepared by the anthropologists. To me, it appears that the feedback which they're giving seem to be genuine. For example, that the degree, like you rightly brought out, sir, Taliban's the degree of acceptability between 1996 and 2021 has grown in the society of Afghans. Second, Talibans have gone in to induct or recruit Tajiks, Uzbeks, as also Turks. These are the few inputs which have come. To an extent, I was amazed to read a report which gives very amazing development, which perhaps you would be knowing. I really wonder if Hazaras would be ever towing the line or reconciling with the Pashtuns. I doubt, sir. There is a statement to that effect. Third, so with a criminal case against Taliban in the International Criminal Court, one is it fell off for lack of correct expression. Aren't we compromising the basic tenet of the rule of law in the world order, sir? This Taliban 20 years back, which was actually gone absolutely berserk with the Sharia law, applying all kinds of extremes of Wahhabism, carrying out torture, brutalities, thousands of criminal cases lying in the court, international court, criminal court. Is there a case in point that the entire world order has to sit down together, conceptually decide whether to go in for terrorism or to respect rule of law and unite together to make sure that Taliban is not allowed to get into the seat of power? Thank you, sir.
I wish I could respond to your last observation in the affirmative, much as I would like to have a world order based on justice and fairness. Unfortunately, it is not. You know it, General Saab, as I do, that the world order is based on interests, and each country looks at its own interests selectively. And that is the unfortunate truth. Second, I think there was a very interesting question you mentioned about the Hazaras. My own understanding is that the Taliban, the hardcore of the Taliban, the Pashtun core of the Taliban, who've grown up in these Deobandi, at the end of the day, the Taliban were very strict. The seminaries that they grew up in were Deobandi seminaries. There was, of course, an infusion of Wahhabism, but they were staunchly anti-Shia. So, in this sense, their treatment of the Hazara Shias was always very, very harsh. And there have been reports that they've treated them very badly in the Ghazni province, where in the Hazara sections of the Ghazni province, and then in Daikundi, etc. But on an ethnic basis, the relationship of the Hazaras and the Pashtuns of the old days, in the old days, was a little more complex. And sometimes I found that the Hazara has somehow greatest, I won't say sympathy, but certainly a greater, he felt that he could negotiate better with the Pashtun than he could with the Tajik.
Okay.
So this was a terribly complex thing. And of course, I'm mindful of the fact that we have an Afghan friend here who would know far more of this. But that was my experience, that one could not straitjacket this in terms of in social terms, that this was the common thing. So there were all kinds of intersections in these relationships.
May I ask the last question?
Yeah, please.
Is the current situation likely to spill over into India, sir? Is Al-Qaeda, Indian subcontinent, oblique ISIS likely to gain deeper penetration into the subcontinent in times ahead because of the ongoing crisis? Your assessment, please, sir.
Look, my own impression is that if that there is a contest between Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and that the Taliban have an old connect with Al-Qaeda, even if they've assured the Americans that they will not allow the Al-Qaeda. So they will not have sympathy for the ISIS. That is clear. Second, as of now, I don't see prospects of an influx of a large number of Taliban being sort of moving into Kashmir. In any case, I am clear in my mind that the security grids that we've established are sufficiently strong and resilient to handle anything that may come. Yes, we'll have to focus attention, we'll have to be very, very clear. But one of the reasons why I thought India must talk to the Taliban, and I've been saying this because I saw that if the Afghan government was talking to the Taliban and every other major country was, then why shouldn't we? And one of the reasons was to make it clear, to make our red lines clear to them. That look, this is something which will not be acceptable to us. Apart from the fact that we expect that you behave according to international norms on human rights, but yet if it comes to your being aligned with the Pakistanis and causing harm to us harm to our security, then you will have to treat India will have to treat you in inimical terms. It will have no choice. So on Kashmir, as of now, I think we've got to be very alert, but I'm not deeply concerned as of now. I haven't seen evidence to indicate that I should be concerned as a scholar and an analyst, because that's what I am now.
Thank you, sir.
Try to be.
Karan, do you see any other?
Yeah, there are a couple of questions, but I think we should close because
Okay.
we normally get a complaint that we spill on the time. And
Okay.
Ambassador, I had requested Ambassador only till 5 o'clock. He's
Okay.
been courteous
No,
with a smiling
that's
face
very
answer. It's 5:23. So if the chairman permits, I would like
Yeah.
to then start rounding off.
Yeah, my thanks and hand over to you, Chairman.
Ambassador, we must thank you. Your talk has really been very illuminating in these confusing times, getting different signals from different places. We are thankful to you for your time and talking to us. If you wish, I had a very quick question. The Russians refused refugees, saying that in the guise of refugees, we do not want militants to enter through the back door. I many times wonder why India, in its magnanimity, permits all types of people to come in. Am I wrong? Or do they filter in very strongly? Of course, you have mentioned about Taliban coming into Kashmir, but those were the militants. But as refugees, do we use a strong filter so that nobody infiltrates or takes this backdoor route? The other was, I'm wondering, when the Americans had trained the Afghan soldiers, they might not have given the latest equipment, but certainly they were given some equipment. Why did they fall so quickly and without resistance in front of Taliban? Means, was it the brotherly relationship which said, why spill blood? Or was it the bad equipment that they knew that the Taliban's will outnumber us, or they have better equipment and therefore we stand no chance against them? What was it that they fell apart? If you could just briefly tell us this.
I think on refugees, well, as you know, we don't we are not signatories to the international conventions on refugees. Yet our own record on giving permission to people who've been persecuted outside or who fear persecution has been outstanding to not only in times past but during the decades of our independence. So we have a different national ethos than the Russians. I do also believe that our filtration methods, which are employed by our agencies and security people, are careful and fairly rigorous to ensure that if anyone tries to enter who's inimical to our interests, can be isolated and dealt with. When it comes to why did the army fall? I now expect that there'll be scholarly treatises written all over the world on this question. My own feeling is that it did uh, because of a lack of motivation and because the political structure just couldn't hold. I'm clear in my mind that and I don't know if you have a couple of minutes, I'd like to elaborate on this because this is very interesting. You see, Afghanistan had evolved. Or let me go back. My own reading is, and I'm again mindful that we have an Afghan friend who can he can contradict me if my understanding is wrong. But my own understanding is that starting from the middle of the 18th century, Afghanistan, the land that we know as Afghanistan between the two rivers, traditionally, later on, of course, the Durand has come, the Durand line. The two rivers are the Amu, the Sindhu, and the Amu Darya. This came to be from the middle of the 18th century, even though it was not populated only by the Pashtuns, it came to be dominated by them. And the Pashtun thought that it was it was almost as if, how should I put it? It was his right to be the final, to hold the final power in Afghanistan. He co-opted others, but he wanted to remain supreme. Second, it became a very curious structure. Politically, if you look at it, there was a very strong central authority. The government was, it was a unitary kind of government, except that in the old days, the social structures, and because of that, the political power structures were very diffused by the time it came to the different regions. So, whereas, I mean, it was a total old kind of situation where there was the king and the king's command was supreme, but when it came to local affairs, unless necessary, he didn't interfere in them. Now, one other fact, and that is what I mentioned, that during Amir Abdul Rahman Khan's time, he located Pashtun settlements all along the western frontiers and then the north and the northeast frontiers, not so much in Badakhshan, but certainly in Takhar and Kunduz, and the most fertile lands were given to them. And they became a kind of an anchor for this Pashtun rule in areas which were traditionally Tajik and then in the west, Uzbek, etc. So, this polity, I think, began to, or this idea of the Afghan polity began to be challenged, certainly in the second half of the last century, gradually. Then, when it came to constitution making in 2003 and 4, my own feeling is that that the old Pashtun technocracy, bureaucracy, the old ruling classes came from outside, and they thought that it should again become a centralized state. At that stage, they had the option to make it quasi-federal, something like India's. In fact, as ambassador, I remember chatting with some Afghan leaders, and I said, "Well, it's for you to decide." But don't you think that things should be more diffused? And they said, "No, it's much too unstable, and we've got to create the stability." And then there was all this propaganda against warlords. Our Afghan friend mentioned Ata Muhammad Noor, who's a great jihadi fighter. But then he and others and painted as warlords, and the whole attempt was to finish them and get the centralized government in power. And that, I think, failed. Because instead of forming a truly democratic multi-ethnic party, Karzai, I think, failed in that completely. He could have acted I mean, as I look back, he could have acted as a modern democratic leader, formed a led and tried to lead, formed and then lead a multi-ethnic party. But somehow the question of ethnicity, which to my mind is basic to Afghanistan, was was swept aside, as if it was of little consequence. That we are all Afghans; it doesn't matter our ethnic background. But to my mind, it's really important in Afghanistan. So Karzai, instead of doing it like this, acted more like an old Popalzai chief. He is Popalzai, the same. He belongs to the same sub tribe of the Mohammedzais, which Ahmad Shah Abdali came from. Later on, of course, Zahir Shah, etc., became Mubarakzais, but he is Popalzai. So I often felt that he acted more like a Popalzai chief, manipulating all this instead of being a truly democratic leader, building a democratic state with a party system, and that would have meant going into, despite the risks of going and sitting in these different areas, telling the people that the way out was, modernization of old democracies, that Afghan people have to think anew. But he didn't. And Ghani, of course, frankly, I regret to say I have no respect for him, because I don't think he ever had leadership qualities. Karzai did. Ghani never did.
Charan,
That's
sorry.
the wrong choice.
Yeah.
Sorry for going at length, but I thought.
It reminds me of a story. On this matter, I'm 100% in agreement with Mr. Karju. So let me tell you a little story. About a decade or more ago, I proposed a federal structure, by the way, federal structure precisely keeping this in mind. And I had a very dear Afghan friend whose father was a cabinet minister in Zahir Shah's government, who violently opposed the whole idea of federal.
What was his name? Was he a Pashtun?
Yes, he was definitely a Pashtun. Who was, I mean, I was surprised at his vehement, which exactly what you're saying, that Afghanistan has always been a unitary state, that, we people, the Afghans, are very united. You guys think we are, by the way, incidentally, he was a very interesting fellow. His mother was a Bengali, whose father had met when he was studying in Calcutta. Very interesting.
I bet he was a Suleiman Khail.
I don't want to name him because he's not here himself.
No, I don't think you should.
Okay, anyway, with that.
I think we've
Ambassador,
thank you.
Ambassador, though you say that Ghani, you have least respect for Ghani, and you are the ambassador, I am only an economist. But I must say, Ghani waited till they landed up in Kabul. So to my mind, Ghani must have expected at least somebody will put up some resistance. But these guys just rolled over and walked straight into Kabul. So that is where I was thinking, nobody in the American trained army, none of the generals, none of the local people even attempted to resist Taliban.
Where
to the credit of
I think, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Saab, but it is the necessity. It is incumbent on the president, who's the commander in chief, and in Afghanistan, the Afghan army institutionally may have been made by the Americans, but in the mind and in the heart and in their responses, they are very different. Please don't refract the Afghan army like you would refract the Indian army. No. For the Afghan army, even though it is professionally trained, its loyalty lies, it must see exemplary courage and leadership on the part of the president, who is the commander in chief. And they won't have this notion that he is he's only the symbolic head. Where did they see him? They saw him in the ARG talking academic talk, which might make sense to social scientists and academics abroad. it didn't make sense to half his cabinet or even 90% of his cabinet, what the fellow used to talk about. I'm telling you, I was there when he was finance minister. You can be brilliant as an academic or a social scientist, but that doesn't make you a leader of a country, and leave alone a country like Afghanistan. And at the end of it all, what did he show? Did he stay on? Or whatever excuses he may give? वो तो भाग गया साहब. He'll be remembered in Afghan history as the man who ran away.
Yeah, and in the
I may
academic
be
world,
very
as a
harsh with him, but
yeah, I agree
ask
with you.
my
And
Afghan friend if I'm wrong. Ask him.
you know, you're right. I agree with you because in the academic world, he has let us down too, writing such an influential book. And when it came to really apply and play for it and die for it, he just walked away. I also thought for a long time, had he been a captain of a ship, he would have decided to stay back and fight till the last drop of his blood. And then it was a different thing. But then I agree with you. Well, now that you have said, and I don't mind if the chairman permits, we can ask Farhad Sultani to be brief and make a last remark.
Yes, I think I would write that. Please tell me if I'm wrong. I'll be very happy to hear that I'm wrong.
Okay, Farhad Sultani, please be brief. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, sir, I totally agree. We totally agree. So I do categorize the challenge and the problem of Afghanistan into three categories: the national problem, regional problem, and international problem. The question is this: so from where we can start? Should we start from the national level, regional level, or international level? Let me post a question. Usually I do post this question in Afghanistan because I work as a professor assistant in my country at the Faculty of Public Policy and Administration. If Afghanistan would be stabilized, which ethnic group will articulate their interest? This is the first question, whether it is Hazara, Tajik, Pashtun, Uzbek. But to my, what do I think? It means I do believe that in 20 years, so the Tajik, Uzbek, Hazara, they have great achievements around the group. We can see that, we can see them everywhere. And the second question that I pose, if Afghanistan would be destabilized, which ethnic group can articulate their interest? Definitely the Pashtun people will articulate their interest. I have full information, so regarding to why the Afghan National Army didn't fight against the Taliban. I totally agree with you that they're well structured and they're well, well trained. The point is here, Ghani was totally thinking about only Pashtun people. The place where I'm living, that is Mazar-e Sharif. The governor of Mazar-e Sharif was Farhad Azimi. He was constantly receiving call from Ghani that please hand over the province to the Taliban and leave that province. That is the main reason that the other minorities like Tajik and Pashto, Uzbek, Hazara, they were not feeling. The second point, so he has appointed the Ministry of Defense like Khaled. Right now, he was in the USA. Afghanistan is an Islamic country. Someone who does not strongly believe in Islamic platform, how the soldier come to understand against the Taliban, how the soldiers come to fight against the Taliban, sometimes I can kid with my friends. The situation that I'm seeing in my country, I cry entire night. Definitely, sir told us that I will not respect Ghani. If I see Ghani, so definitely I'm going to kill him because we lost everything. I came in India. I thought I will go to back my country despite these challenges. So we will come together hand to hand. We can make our countries. These Pashtun people, sir, they will, they will. For them, the civilized and sophisticated Afghanistan does not have any meaning. They will only think, there should be war, but our ethnic should be in power. I do believe that, and I read number of story books, even if the Taliban continue like this, so this government will not sustain. So today, okay, they are in the cities, so to some extent they pressurize the people. Tomorrow, they cannot do like this. If I go to my country, So if they try to, clean my ethnicity, I do belong to Tajik. If they try to clean my ID, if they do not recognize my ID, definitely I'm going to pick up again, because the education, the pen is not, if the pen is not working, so the action did it, we do that. So it's the matter of the time. Still, I'm in close in touch with some of my friends who are living in Panjshir and some of my friends who are living in Mazar Sharif. So I do think the minorities like Azara, like Tajik, like Uzbek, we do believe in humanitarian, and we do believe in, in a better Afghanistan. But these tribes, they don't believe that. That's why I do propose that let's go for partition. I do propose that let's go for federalism. So I don't know, so whether this take place or no, but if the situation continues like that, definitely one day Afghanistan will be, they will go for partition. Still, there is talks. I have followed some Afghan medias. So still there is discussion, there is talk among the Afghan local elites. So that could be the good option. Otherwise, the situation is like this. I totally respect your speech, and I'm in the same page with you. So this is the price that we pay. Ghania's escape. I'm the member of I'm the government, I'm working at the government level. The government has not paid 3 months for me. My life is based on my salary. Now my kids, they don't have anything to eat. So how we should respect for this guy? And one final remark, Ghani has not written any book. That book, How to Fix the Broken Estate. This book has not been written by Ghani. Ghani is the co-author of this book. So you can search, you can see, you cannot find a single paper that Ghani has been written. And sometimes I can discuss with my friends, I'm telling them, if a Pashtun who has been educated in the Western country and he was he claimed that I was professor at the university level, if this guy is coming to in my country and if he, like this guy is doing this action, so what expectation should we have from the ordinary Taliban that they're at the front line for fighting?
I must thank the ambassador. I also want to thank Farhad Sultani. I can see his emotions and passion. I totally understand we are spending the 75th year of India's partition. Many of us lost a lot in the partition. I'm sure many of you in Afghanistan understand that partition means lots of difficulties, challenges, bloodshed. In our country, it happened because of the British. The Prime Minister has declared August 14 as the painful day. I'm still surprised, and therefore I appreciate the pain that you are having, that staying in India, despite the knowledge and the troubles that partition causes, you are advocating partition for a country. I can understand, and I'm sure on the panel as well as the participants can understand your pain. But we must close here and we must go on. I have two good important news to share with you. One is Ambassador Kachu has been very, very good today, and we would be putting the recording on our website. No, if you don't want, we will not.
No, please. I've not said anything that embarrasses me in any way.
So our recording will be ready by tomorrow noon. We will put it up on our website. On October 8th, about a month and a half from today, things I expect would settle down. Things would be decided. We are having Ambassador Gautam Mukhopadhyay speak to us on Afghanistan again. And I would invite all of you, and including Ambassador Kachu, if you can please join us, and you, Mr. Sultania, if you can join us, and we will take the discussion further and see what has happened in the next month and a half. On Friday, from 4 p.m., we have another discussion, not on Afghanistan, but on a topic close to Afghanistan. Medium-term security challenges for India by Brigadier Arun Sagar. So I would invite all of you to also spare some time, because these are all interrelated issues, to join us in that discussion again. So once again, let me thank our chairman, Dr. Arvind Virmani, to have conducted these proceedings, Ambassador Kaju for joining us, and all the participants and all the people who asked such important questions that the discussion was enriched. Thank you very much, and see you soon on Friday evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.